Welcome to Family Research Council's 2019 Year in Review on Facebook Live. I'm Travis Weber, Vice President for Policy and Government Affairs here at Family Research Council. And today we're going to bring you a little bit of what we did over the past year, advocating for life, family, and religious liberty here in our nation's capital and around the country. Before we do that, I'm going to allow the members of our team here with me on stage to introduce themselves, and we're going to give you our favorite Christmas movie. But before I turn it off to Connor, I'm going to tell you that my favorite Christmas movie is Elf.
And my name is Connor Semmelsberger. I'm the legislative assistant here at Family Research Council. My favorite movie is National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation.
That's mine. Okay, so
Great movie.
Yes, I'm Patrina Mosley, the Director of Life, Culture, and Women's Advocacy, and yeah, that is my all-time favorite movie. Although I will say, watch the TV version, not the DVD version.
I'm Ariel Del Turco. I'm a research assistant for international religious liberty issues, and my favorite Christmas movie, I think, is A Christmas Story.
My name is David Clausen. I serve as the Director of Christian Ethics and Biblical Worldview here at FRC, and my favorite Christmas movie of all time is Die Hard.
That is not a Christmas movie.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
That's
Absolutely.
Christmas. Hi, my name is Matt Carpenter. I'm the Deputy Director of State and Local Affairs here at Family Research Council, and I can't decide my favorite Christmas movie if it's Home Alone 1 or 2. So I'll just say the series. I don't know about the third one, but it's Home Alone for sure.
All right, we're excited you're with us today, and we're going to have a conversation now with our team up here just about what we've done this past year to let you see some of the successes we've had and the work that FRC has been involved in. So to start us off, Patrina, I'm going to turn to you. A lot of the focus this year has been on the life issue. We're going to talk a bit about what we've been doing on the life issue, but just take us back to earlier this year with the events that really prompted all the movement that we've seen on the life issue this year.
Yeah, we started off with the bang, and it looked dismal, but it actually worked out for our good. So as many of you know, we have been winning in the states for a long time with many pro-life legislation, and the pro-abortion side has taken notice of that now that we're in a very pro-life administration, and with the court seemingly hopefully to be more pro-life, the pro-abortion side has said that we're going to take our agenda more towards the states and enact what they would call reproductive health acts. And so these acts would allow abortion up to the day of birth. And in New York, we actually saw that happen. And we actually saw the passage of that terrible type of act pass in New York, and they celebrated it and lit up their Empire State Building in pink. So, and applauding this effort. And they were thinking that this was going to be so progressive of them, this was going to be so pro-women of them. And actually, it turned a lot of Americans off. And it woke up a lot of independents and a lot of people who were timid in their pro-life views to be more open and more aggressive in fighting for life. So we've actually seen a resurgence of pro-life activism because of that.
Now, after New York, we had events develop in Virginia.
Yes.
What happened down there?
Oh, I mean, double whammy. Virginia, blackface Governor Ralph Northam, at the same time as he was caught in a racist blackface, he was promoting infanticide. And he, as a pediatrician, was very open about what would happen to a child if they happened to survive a botched abortion. And they would basically place the child off to the side and have a discussion about whether they wanted to keep it alive or not. And that, again, woke a lot of people up in this country to say, you know what? I can't go for that. And that was another contributing factor to the resurgence we've seen in pro-life activism in America.
So, Connor, Patrina has reviewed a bit of kind of what happened in terms of the public momentum that galvanized attention on this issue. How was this reflected on Capitol Hill in the halls of Congress in terms of the response up there?
Yeah, it really became the pro-life issue for members of Congress, both in the Senate and House. In February, right after that happened, the Senate was able to have a vote within days on the bill. Unfortunately, it didn't pass, but then the House took up the mantle as well. We know that Speaker Pelosi is in charge over in the House, and the Republicans are now in the minority, the pro-life party there. However, they did not let that deter them. They instantly filed a discharge petition led by the whip there, leadership, Steve Scalise taking up the mantle to file this petition, that if a majority of members, 218, signed on, they could have a vote on the bill, which they ultimately won, a vote on this bill. And then every single day that they could, members of Congress went down to the floor asking for unanimous consent to bring this for a vote, hit 80 times, so great effort there. And it even got so bad that the Democrats were trying to put this bill down so bad, this Born Alive bill, that Republicans had to have their own minority hearing in the basement of the Capitol, which many of folks at FRC were there, pro-lifers across the country, to bring testament to this issue, having doctors, having women who have survived abortions come speak to the issue. So it really just became the pro-life issue for 2019.
Now, a lot of this work that you reviewed is stuff we've been involved in up in Congress throughout the past year. But just taking us back to the bill, we're talking about a bill that was introduced in the House and the Senate in response to what Patrina outlined, what happened in Virginia and New York. So what's the name of that bill, and how does that bill differ? Why is it needed? What does it offer in terms of protections that were not in place before?
Yeah, so it's the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and it's really important because in 2002 there was a federal law passed that added in the law that all persons born alive are persons under the law, but it added no enforcement, no actual legal tools to help these infants who survive abortion. So this law adds those necessary health protections and legal protections for the women to ensure that every infant that does survive an abortion gets the exact same care as any child would at the same gestational age. So it is really important, and why it's so important for Congress to push this bill is because across the states it's really much a patchwork of laws that our research found that yes, 34 states have Born Alive laws, but they're very weak, and those protections on the books do not fully protect those infants like they should.
So we're talking about adding more protections for these babies who could be left to die after they survive a failed abortion. And we're talking about working to ensure the House has to bring this up for a vote and to get the bill passed in the Senate. We know President Trump would sign it. Yep. This should be a no-brainer. So this is the kind of thing which we, as Christians and working at a Christian organization, feel very strongly it's important to continue to focus on. A few kind of projects and ways that we're trying to do this we have out there. One is our End Birthday Abortion campaign, where we're trying to deliver baby hats to symbolize these babies whose lives are in jeopardy. Patrina, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we started the End Birthday Abortion campaign to give people a way to get involved now that we've seen this resurgence in pro-life activism. So this campaign involves purchasing a $9 baby hat to send to Nancy Pelosi's office to say that we as Americans do not support infanticide. We do not support withholding medical care from an infant that has survived an abortion attempt. And we have seen thousands of baby hats come in through this campaign and thousands more to go. We even saw a church come and partner with us in campaigning for ending birthday abortion, and this was started out of their women's ministry. They knew that being pro-women meant being pro-life, and as a women's ministry they gathered together funds to not only support their local pregnancy centers but our End Birthday Abortion campaign, and we were able to make a really good dent in our goal in sending 90,000 baby hats to Nancy Pelosi.
This is something we're going to continue working on entering 2020.
2020.
So we've talked about this issue at the federal level. Matt, I want to turn to you real quick because, as Connor and Patrina have explained, we're focused on this issue on Capitol Hill, but the issue is also playing out in the states. Can you talk a little bit about where we've seen positive developments in protecting these babies born alive after failed abortions throughout the states?
Sure. I mean, Patrina hit the nail on the head. There was really a moment there in the states where Governor Northam came out and just laid to bear before the nation what the pro-abortion left was okay with, letting child who survive abortions die by neglect or other means. And so the states began immediately moving to fix that patchwork that Connor outlined earlier. Texas enacted a bill earlier this year to put some teeth on their Born Alive Infant Protection Act already. They had the 2002 language. They added actual enforcement mechanisms. We saw bills also move in North Carolina and Montana. Unfortunately, those bills were vetoed, but there was an effort to override the governor's veto in North Carolina, which we were involved in. Unfortunately, we fell one vote short of overriding the governor's veto in the Senate there. But other bills have been popped up and introduced elsewhere, and we think that that'll continue on to the next year. So we've seen a lot of positive development on that issue. And one thing that was really interesting to see from the last session was just, Patrine touched on this a little bit, was some of the polling, some of the sentiment around people clinging on to the pro-life identity over pro-choice. After Governor Northam's comments and after Governor Cuomo signed that bill into law, we saw just a sea change. Just people started coming out and saying, I'm pro-life now. And so for the first time in a decade or two, we've seen the number of people who identify as pro-life to pro-choice actually reach parity here. So that's kind of an exciting time.
Now, at the state level, we've seen increasingly growing number of Democrats supporting voting for these protections.
Right.
Federal level, there's a pretty big split between the parties. Democrats refusing to bring up this bill in the House. But at the state level, thankfully, the pro-life ethic is crossing party lines, and we hope to reach a place where all people are pro-life. But talk a little bit about what's going on with that shift in the states.
Yeah, so in the states, we've been tracking all the pro-life bills basically in the states. And we've spent the past year looking at who's voting for those bills. And interestingly enough, as you point out, we've identified about 130 Democrats at the state level of all backgrounds, all religious persuasions, all races and ethnicities, supporting some version of a pro-life policy in their state. And I'm not going to go out and say that they're pro-life legislators, but they're recognizing that there's an inherent dignity to human life, and they're voting for some iteration of pro-life legislation that they get coming across their desk. So that's incredibly encouraging, especially here in D.C., where it seems like when one party is in lockstep trying to advance a pro-abortion agenda, that's not the case in the states.
There's a story out there that's not always told. If we open up our Google, the top line news, the newspaper, there's a lot of positive developments out there, positive news that we can celebrate on our work for life, family, and religious freedom that we don't always see upon first glance of the news. So this is part of the story that we want to tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, David, turning to you, we're talking about the life issue in terms of developments culturally, action at the federal level, in the halls of Congress, at the state level, in policy. One of the things you've been really focused on is developing how we think about these issues from a biblical worldview. Since joining us this year full time, you've started to work in that area, and you've produced material articulating why Christians support a pro-life ethic, why we are pro-life, as grounded in our theology. So how did you develop that, and how does that fit in with how we think about the life issue in terms of policy?
Yeah, absolutely. So since joining the team, one of my big goals has been to produce our Biblical Worldview series, because I think it was Gallup or Pew did a poll last year that said 7% of Americans, only 7% of Americans have what could be described as a biblical worldview. That means the vast majority of our friends and our neighbors don't think about these issues through the lens of Scripture. That means a lot of people that go to our churches really aren't thinking through these issues the way the Bible informs us to think about these issues. So I launched our Biblical Worldview series, and already there's 3 installments in that. 1, how Christians can think about politics, political engagement. 2, religious liberty. And 3, the life issue as well. So just the goal is to help Christians, to help pastors think through these, what might be kind of seen as political issues that are really biblical issues, and how the Bible can inform our thinking on these issues.
So your publication on life and how we have a pro-life worldview, biblical worldview, we've circulated that over this past year and tried to engage Christians who may at some level say, yes, I agree with you, give some level of agreement, but are not really engaged in terms of policy and putting their beliefs into action.
Right.
We've disseminated and tried to share this perspective in the hope that they will carry to completion what they believe in terms of acting on that. And so, all these things that we've been talking about, we've tried to connect them to the church, Christians across America, in terms of how they live out their faith.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. At least, especially with the abortion one I put together, that was actually kind of inspired by one of the Democrats running for president, who on the campaign trail said, well, as a Christian, as someone who believes the Bible teaches that life begins with breath. Therefore, it's okay to be pro-abortion. In fact, we should be pro-abortion. And that got me thinking, one, that's so terrifying in one sense that he's making a theological argument. It's a bad theological argument, but nonetheless a theological argument. And so I wanted to go, what does Scripture actually teach on the life issue? And I argue in the publication that from cover to cover, the Bible affirms the personhood of the unborn. And not just does the Bible teach clearly on this issue, 2,000 years of church history, Roman Catholic, Orthodox, all branches of Protestantism have interpreted Scripture to teach that life begins at conception and that life is inherently valuable. And so then not only do we need to know that knowledge, we need to apply that. And we need to be aware of where the major parties are, where they're advocating on these issues, what the party platforms say. And so we need to put feet to our beliefs on these issues.
You and I have talked about this work, and you know, as we've looked at the arguments for a biblical worldview on life, it's just crystal clear. And let's talk a little bit about the religious liberty approach. You know, we obviously engage a lot in religious liberty in a host of areas here in terms of federal, state policy, engaging the culture, encouraging Christians and others to stand up for their faith and their beliefs in a public square, which is growing increasingly hostile. How can we help Christians think through the biblical roots of religious liberty?
Yeah, great question. Let's define our terms. You know, religious liberty is just the ability, the freedom to believe what you want to believe and then to live your life in accordance with those deeply held beliefs. And that understanding of religious liberty is rooted in Scripture. Jesus famously, when he was being pressed by the religious leaders of his day, was being pressed on these issues, and he said, well, you know, you need to render unto God the things that are God's and the things that are Caesar's, the things that are Caesar's, which he's teaching that there are some things that belong exclusively to God. Our primary allegiance is to God, and the state or who's ever in charge can't demand loyalty in a sphere that doesn't belong to theirs.
So this informs how we approach religious liberty advocacy in a host of areas, both domestically in terms of the relationship between our religious faith and our obligation to God, and the power of the government to regulate, or so-called claimed power of the government to regulate that or interfere with it. It has to be navigated because obviously religious liberty has limits in terms of you can't claim you can do anything in the name of religion. Well, obviously not. There are limits to having an orderly civil society under the contours, guidance of our Constitution, our government here. But we have to be very careful to guard against the claims of the government over religion. There's no automatic right to regulate religion, just like other areas of life. And this is something we've in some ways not had to fight for here historically, and are growing more and more, or becoming into a phase when we have to fight for our rights here at home. At the same time that we've advocated for religious liberty here at home, we've worked on it more and more internationally. And I think this is where it's important for the church to see that we're fighting for the same right, the right to live out our faith, whether it's here at home or for our persecuted brothers and sisters overseas, or for even non-Christians. I mean, the religious liberties, we protect the right of all people of all faiths to live out their faith freely without civil government interfering, because God does not force us to choose and follow Him. We're not going to use the power of government to force others to follow God. We want to share the gospel, share the good news, and pray for them, but not compel. So that's how we think about religious liberty. We have been doing more and more work on that. So Ariel, I'm going to turn to you because we've worked a lot on this and focused on some key areas over the past year. It's important for our viewers to know where we've been really focusing. China, Northeast Syria, in terms of regions, and also on the issue of apostasy, blasphemy, and anti-conversion laws, which deal with that last component that I mentioned. Those laws all restrict in some way the freedom that people have to choose to worship as they see fit. So we want to work to limit those laws and their abuse that limits not only people who want to find Christ and turn to Christianity, but people of all faiths. So we've been doing more and more work, as you know, on the international side of things. What have you been looking at, tracking in terms of the issue in China? This is an issue that's been in the news a lot. People have heard about the protest in Hong Kong, perhaps the Uyghur issue, situation in China. They know that President Trump's engaged in trade negotiations, so China's in the news. What is it with China's religious freedom violations and how we helped highlight them?
Yeah, as you said, China's been in the news a lot. And one of the reasons, as you highlighted, has been the protests in Hong Kong. And while this has gotten a lot of media attention, what hasn't gotten as much media attention is the religious freedom aspects of this issue. The people in Hong Kong are protesting for greater democracy and against Chinese Communist Party encroachment in their city. But part of that, their motivation and the motivation of Hong Kong Christians who have been involved in this protest is that they know their religious freedom is at stake if China has more influence in that city. China right now is one of the worst violators of religious freedom on earth today. We see people of all faiths targeted, so that includes Christians, it includes Uyghur Muslims, it includes Falun Gong practitioners, as well as Tibetan Buddhists and others. U.S. officials have even gone so far as to call China's campaign against faith like a war on faith. So this is a big deal, and Hong Kong Christians know that. So while they're taking a stand, FRC has been shining a spotlight on this issue, and really this is one of the best approaches when dealing with a foreign government, especially the Chinese government, is just the naming and shaming. Chinese leaders really care about what the rest of the world thinks about them and what other leaders on the world stage think. So for us, as the rest of the world, need to be pointing out China's human rights violations and religious freedom violations, and they need to know that they're not going to be treated just like any other country until they fix these human rights issues.
It's a challenge because of China's economic power, and they can really throw that around. As you know, FRC has moved in the direction of growing some of these relationships to better advocate for international religious freedom that we've not maybe had as much historically. We've hosted North Korea defectors here in the building, highlighted their tragic stories, and really tried to use the freedom that we have here in the United States to shine a light on what's going on around the world and connect the dots for people, because religious freedom is the same right that we're trying to protect, whether internationally or at home. There's different histories and context, and we're blessed to have a long history of freedom in America. We want to use that freedom to advocate for people around the world. So as you've worked with me in sort of developing some of these relationships and worked on this issue, what over the past year have there been things that have stood out to you particularly in terms of people who it's just been fun to get to know as we've been blessed with this opportunity to do this work, or particular events, maybe developments that have struck you as particularly important, or just stay with you in your work here?
Well, I think one of the most important things that FRC has been involved in is the situation in northeast Syria. And this is a little complicated, but essentially in October, the U.S. withdrew the few remaining troops we'd had there, and this paved the way for Turkey to invade that area. And the reason why it's a religious freedom issue and something that FRC cares about is that the Kurds in that region had established a federal government system with really strong religious freedom protections, really strong women's rights as well. And so we had hoped that this area would be a really good model for the rest of the Middle East of what good religious freedom policies can look like, because they don't have very many other good examples. And the Christian community had really thrived there, which again, we don't see in very many other places in the Middle East. So FRC was able to really just be a voice for the persecuted Christians there in this larger foreign policy discussion, which, I mean, you're not typically going to hear the concerns of Christian minorities in the Middle East in larger foreign policy contexts. So it was really meaningful for me that FRC was able to be a part of that and a leader on this issue.
This is an important issue, and I think God really allowed us to be involved in this issue by bringing it before us. Some things developed where it became clear to me that the Lord wanted us to be involved in this, and we were trying to work on highlighting that freedom in northeast Syria that you talked about before a lot of this hit the news with President Trump's withdrawal of troops. because the Middle East is a difficult place, and the Kurdish-led government in northeast Syria had been trying to develop freedom that allow people to choose and even change faith from Islam, which is uncommon in the Middle East, to have a government supporting that. This is something that we really wanted to highlight and help shed light on. Now we're going to continue to advocate on it and continue to defend religious freedom around the world. Obviously, we've talked about issues in other places, Nigeria, Iran, Egypt, and elsewhere in Africa, the Middle East, including North Korea. We had a North Korea defector speak at Values Voters Summit this year. So this is something we're going to continue to work on and continue to connect the dots with the issue here domestically. So just turning back to the domestic quickly, kind of looking at religious freedom, a lot of the ways we've seen it arise domestically have been defensive measures over this past year in terms of working to stop policies and bills that would infringe on religious freedom. Connor, as you know, at the federal level, we worked to stop the Equality Act, which would have been a blow for religious freedom by imposing a construct of sexuality and an ideology upon Christian organizations, Christians in many facets of American life. This was a big defensive stop by preventing that from passing the Senate, even coming up in the Senate. Obviously, the Democrat-controlled House passed it, but we limited the number of Republicans supporting it to a real small number through FRC's work on Capitol Hill, constant engagement day to day, and trying to communicate the real problem that this is for religious freedom. Matt, at the state level, we're obviously engaged in a number of, while we've been working on the life issue, a number of religious freedom issues, working to stop them. In addition, what we've seen come up domestically is this transgender ideology, which is sweeping the nation, it seems like, the federal and state level. So talk a little bit, I know you've been looking into this and helping us think through the issue, develop a response. Give us your perspective on what's happening there and how do we think about this?
Right, well, a few months ago, you may be familiar with James Younger, who's a 7-year-old Texan he was actually caught up in a custody battle between his two parents. His mother wanted him to continue in pursuing a gender identity different from his biological sex. And his father just knew him as James, a healthy, happy young boy who fit in nicely everywhere he was as James. And so that situation really caught the attention of millions of Americans, and for the first time, I think a lot of people considered the fact that a 7-year-old child could be exposed to puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones with the intention of eventually doing irreversible, harmful, and experimental gender reassignment surgery. And so this was a later development in 2019, but I think looking ahead, nationally, I think state legislators are going to have to come to grips with this is a reality that's going to kind of percolate up through our states because of this gender ideology that's being pushed in schools, in culture. And so dealing with that, how do we address that legislatively? That remains to be seen. But you're right, we are looking into that, and I think there'll be a remedy.
This is an important issue to respond to because we need to defend what's good for all Americans. We need to defend truth and an objective approach to policy, not go along with the ideology of the day, which we know to be harmful for people. And David, this has roots in a biblical worldview, an approach to sexuality, which informs how Christians think about a lot of these things. So there's a connection with how we need to be thinking through these public policy issues, which may seem intimidating, may seem difficult at times. We want to help people think through them, though.
We do want to just help Christians think through these issues. And as a Christian organization, as Christians, I think we're guided in our political engagement by Ephesians 4 that says we're going to be loving, but we're going to speak the truth in love. And some of the stuff we're seeing with gender identity and sexual orientation, like with the Equality Act at the federal level and even state versions that want to codify gender identity and sexual orientation at the same level as religion or national origin or race, that's just bad policy. And as Christians, we're thinking through these issues. What I tell when I go to churches and speak to people, kind of transgender ideology sounds kind of scary. But the Bible actually talks about this too. Even Paul in 1 Corinthians was talking about this in the sense that these ideas are influenced almost by this ancient Gnosticism, that I am not my body, that we are distinct from our body. Even That's something Plato talked about 2,000 years ago, saying that the goal of humanity is ultimately for us to escape our bodies. But as Christians, we understand the body is inherently good. And we, as Christians, we want to advocate for policy that affirms the goodness and the holistic nature of body and soul, that we are integrated wholes. And so that's one way that as Christians, let's speak the truth in love. But when we're looking at these policies that are being put forward to say, hey, these are bad, these are dangerous, and this is not conducive to human flourishing.
So this Christian ethic that you're talking about has implications for the host of issues that we cover. And Patrina, just thinking through some of those issues, in your role handling issues of human dignity, we've covered a number of things that just come up from time to time: pornography, sex trafficking, other issues. How have you talk a little bit about your work over the past year on those issues, on the prostitution issue, and what you've been doing? I'm thinking specifically of our testimony, your testimony against an effort to legalize it in D.C. But how do we think through those issues from a biblical worldview in terms of the policy implications that we see in them?
Yeah, I think that was the highlight for me this year, is the opportunity to represent FRC at the DC Council in testifying in opposition to decriminalizing prostitution. That would essentially make DC a sex tourist destination. And we know that when it comes to the issue of prostitution, it is a human dignity issue. It's a business that profits off of exploiting women. And right now, the argument has been for, well, this is an exploitation. This is an actual profession that deserves, quote unquote, protection. And but the truth is, this is what happens when you don't have a good application of justice. In this particular case here with prostitution, it is exploitation. Sex is not a commodity to be exploited and to become an LLC, essentially. It is a sacred union that is coveted in the marriage union. So this isn't something just to be spread around and make a business, and that comes into the issue of human dignity as well. And testifying against that bill in DC was incredibly exhausting emotionally. You had about 70 organizations represented in the room during this time. Half were in opposition, half were in support of decriminalizing, and the hearing was 14 hours. I was only able to stay for maybe about 9 of those, but it was an exhausting day, but it shows you that we do have a lot that we're up against, and there's a lot that we need to be involved in as far as speaking the truth in love. This is an area where we really do need to speak the truth in love.
Turning to some of the other issues that I know you've been involved in, and Connor, you all both have worked on some of these. A lot of the administration's good work to protect life. We've already talked about the Born Alive issue, but I'm thinking of the Title X issue. So, Connor, just give us a little bit of what do we mean by that issue? What are we talking about there?
Yeah, so like you said, the Title X is a family planning program, multi-million-dollar federal program that goes to family planning services, contraception, and STD testing. And one program which Planned Parenthood has been a grantee ever since its inception. And fortunately this year, President Trump and his administration took a great lead and put their necks out there, put some risk to implement what's called the Protect Life rule, which would say any grantee that receives this money has to be financially and physically separate from any abortion services at all, because abortion is not a method of family planning. And through that, it was a great outcome, because even though it's been held up in the courts, we've had some short-term court victories, which have been greatly due to some Trump-appointed judges. But because of that role, Planned Parenthood, pro-abortion states like Illinois, New York, and even other abortion providers had a decision: are we going to put women's health first or abortion first? And they decided that abortion was ultimate to their position as providers, and they were not going to give that up. So they, as Patrina likes to say, defunded themselves of millions and millions of dollars.
So yeah, what we're talking about here is cutting off money to Planned Parenthood and others, and turning that to organizations instead who are going to provide actual health care to women and not just push abortion and make money off it wherever they can.
Absolutely. I know that many pro-life activists were kind of, I won't say depressed and disappointed, but we've been rallying around defunding Planned Parenthood for a long time. And when I gave a presentation over at Patrick Henry, I was like, how many of you, when you heard we're going to defund Planned Parenthood, you actually believed it? And you had like a few hands that raised their, their hands up and say, yeah, we actually believed it. But you had a lot who was like, yeah, we mantraed around this, but did we actually believe it? But when it came to Title X, we really saw what a difference made in having a pro-life administration, having pro-life leadership from the top down, and having people who were men and women of integrity who knew the law and knew how to be strategic and restore integrity, because the original Title X statute said that you cannot use these funds that go towards abortion as a method of family planning. So when we had a revision and a strengthening of Title X, we saw actually Planned Parenthood defund themselves because they did not want to comply with the original statute of Title X.
So a lot of good movement on the life
Yes.
issue. One of the things we're doing is tracking, going back to the Born Alive issue, status of Born Alive laws in the states at our map, frc.org/pro-life map. That's available for people to see the status of those laws around the country. And I think we could probably sit here for hours and talk in more depth about the many life and conscience related developments we've seen, things we haven't even mentioned, the administration's work implementing a strong Mexico City policy, the conscience rule, protecting conscience for those who don't want to be caught up in abortion, forced to facilitate and be involved in performing abortions. The Trump administration's religious liberty efforts through Health and Human Services, protecting religious freedom for adoption providers, Department of Labor, religious liberty protections. Connor, one other area though is their efforts, the administration's work to cut off funding or reassess funding for fetal tissue research. So what have we been doing on that? What has happened over this past year?
Yeah, this has been a great development. And as you know, in 2015, there was those videos of Planned Parenthood selling this tissue that they would obtain from abortions. They would take the tissue, do abortions certain ways to get this fetal tissue, then go sell and use for research. And we found out for years that the federal government was funding this research directly through the National Institute of Health. And so the Trump administration, the White House was just an all-star on this issue. So many outside forces trying to get them to not do anything on it. And voices like ours and others really advocated to say, what, this is something that we as taxpayers, we as Americans aren't okay with, using our federal dollars to fund this type of unethical research, taking body parts from aborted babies and using it to fund research for cures. And so the Trump administration was strong and said, we're going to do what we can in our power to restrict this as much as we can now, as well as for future contracts, to say this is something that we as the federal government do not want to be involved with, funding tissue research using tissue from aborted babies.
Obviously, there's a lot more we can talk about. Patrina, one of the things we haven't even gotten to is your work on the chemical abortion issue, but this is going to be an issue in the future. Where can folks find more if they want to read more about that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. You can read our issue brief called Chemical Abortion, the New Abortion Battleground. That is found at frc.org/chemical abortion. And that issue brief just lays out what's going to be the next battle in terms of abortion and how we can fight it.
There's a lot of work that we're doing. We haven't even discussed everything right now. One of the other areas, and this goes back to the Worldview issue, David, is our work to make sure the doors remain open for people who are seeking freedom from lifestyle, the LGBT lifestyle, whether religious counseling or other counseling, seeking to leave that lifestyle, making sure they're free to do so, just as we would support the principles of freedom, whether in religious freedom or general freedoms protected by our Constitution across all areas of life for all Americans. That area must remain protected. So folks can find it more on our website if they want to go there. There's a lot of work that we have not covered today. But in bringing this to a close, before we close it out, I want to go through, as we approach the Christmas break, what is one thing that everyone is looking forward to over the Christmas vacation? Connor, what are you looking forward to this year?
Yeah, just being married in September. My wife's family is a big Italian family, so every year they have what's known as the 7 fishes, but in her family, that some years it can be upwards of 8, 9, 10, 11 fishes every year for their Christmas Eve dinner. So
I'll
looking
take
forward
a few
to
of
that.
those for my dinner. So, yeah.
I think for me, just getting time to just drink hot chocolate and relax. I don't know.
I'm looking to relax this vacation. Ariel, what about you?
So my mom on Christmas morning makes homemade donuts, so looking forward to that.
Sounds good.
My mom makes homemade Cinnabons for Christmas morning, which is always fun. And I always look forward on Christmas Eve. We've been doing this for years, that my family goes to a candlelight service, just to have some time to consider, why do we celebrate Christmas? Just to reflect on the birth of Christ.
Right.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to a white Christmas. We're going to New Hampshire and Connecticut, and I think they're expecting some snow. I know they just got hit with some snow in New Hampshire recently, so I don't know if we'll get snow down here in D.C., but I had grown up in New England. That was always a big part of Christmas.
Snow is always nice.
Yeah.
Well, we want to thank you for joining us for this 2019 year review here at Family Research Council. As always, more information at our website, frc.org, where you can read about the issues we've talked about and many others. Again, thanks for joining us.